I remember the sound of the lock more than the moment I agreed to it, a small metallic click that landed somewhere between my ribs and refused to echo, as if my body already knew it would be a long 30 nights before anything inside me would be allowed to open again. I had told myself even then that this wasn't about clothing, not really. That sentence became a kind of talisman I kept turning over in my mind during the first night, sitting on the edge of my bed, the room strangely unfamiliar despite the familiar furniture. I was still in my own apartment, still surrounded by the same books, the same framed photos, the same dent in the wall from when I'd moved in 2 years earlier. And yet everything felt subtly misaligned, like a painting hung just a few degrees off level. I had changed nothing about the room. I had changed something about myself. The agreement had been simple on paper and impossibly complex everywhere else. 30 nights. No exceptions. When I was alone and when I was not. When I slept, when I woke, when I worked from home, when I answered the door. It was not meant as punishment, though part of me suspected I had framed it that way to make it easier to accept. It was meant as an experiment, a forced honesty, a way to interrupt the years I had spent circling the same questions without ever landing. I had spent most of my adult life being good at avoidance. I avoided conflict, avoided asking for help, avoided mirrors when they asked more of me than I wanted to give. On the surface I was stable. Job, friends, routines. Underneath, there was a quiet, persistent discomfort I never learned to name properly. I told myself it was stress or indecision, or the vague dissatisfaction everyone seemed to carry these days. It took me far too long to admit that the unease sharpened around one particular axis. The way I inhabited being a man and the way that identity never quite sat right, no matter how carefully I adjusted it. The clothing was never the beginning of that realization, but it became the focal point because it was tangible. Feelings are slippery, fabric is not. Years earlier, in moments I categorized as curiosity or stress relief, I had tried on women's clothing alone, quickly, always with the undertone of secrecy that made the act feel illicit even when nothing about it was sexual. What I noticed and what unsettled me was not excitement but quiet. A lowering of internal noise, like stepping into a library after standing in traffic. That frightened me more than any obvious thrill would have, because it suggested something structural, something foundational. For years I treated those moments like a private oddity, a footnote that didn't deserve to be integrated into the main text of my life. But footnotes have a way of accumulating. Eventually, you either revise the book or accept that it no longer makes sense. The lock was part of the revision. A friend, one of the few I trusted with the full, awkward truth, had suggested structure. If you keep dipping your toe in and running away, they said, you'll never know what the water is actually like. The idea of commitment, even temporary, terrified me. So we made it time-bound. 30 nights felt survivable. Long enough to matter, short enough not to ruin me, or so I hoped. The first night was the hardest in ways I hadn't anticipated. I expected self-consciousness, maybe embarrassment. What I got instead was a crushing awareness of myself as an object in space. Every movement felt observed, even though I was alone. I became acutely aware of how I sat, how I stood, how I reached for a glass of water. Not because the clothing restricted me, it didn't, but because it disrupted muscle memory. My body no longer moved on autopilot. That disruption forced me to notice habits I'd never questioned. The way I spread myself into rooms, the way I took up space without thinking, the way I assumed a certain neutrality that I suddenly realized was coded. I slept poorly that night, not because I was uncomfortable, but because my mind wouldn't stop narrating. You look ridiculous. You're pretending. You're disrespecting something you don't understand. Each thought arrived with the authority of a verdict. I lay there listening to the city outside, the distant sirens and passing cars, and wondered if this was what honesty felt like at first. Loud, accusatory, relentless. Morning brought a different kind of challenge. Daylight has a way of making everything feel more real, less negotiable. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror longer than usual, not scrutinizing details but trying to reconcile the image with the person I thought I was. The reflection didn't offer answers. It offered questions layered on questions. Who are you doing this for? What do you think will change? What are you afraid will change? I realized then that fear was doing most of the talking. Fear of being seen, yes, but also fear of not being seen. Of discovering that this experiment would mean nothing, that I had built an entire internal drama around something trivial. That possibility felt oddly devastating. If this wasn't important, then what had I been carrying all these years? As the days progressed, routines began to reassert themselves, but they were altered, refracted. Working from home meant video calls, and video calls meant choices. I learned quickly how much effort I'd previously spent not thinking about what I wore, how that effort now doubled as I tried to align professionalism with authenticity, safety with honesty. Sometimes I turned the camera off. Sometimes I didn't. Each decision felt like a small ethical calculus rather than a logistical one. I became more aware of language too, how I spoke about myself in my own head. I noticed how often I defaulted to harshness, how quick I was to frame my actions as indulgent or foolish. The longer the nights went on, the more I started questioning that internal voice. Whose standards was it enforcing? Whose disappointment was I trying to preempt? By the end of the first week, something subtle had shifted. The constant self-surveillance eased, replaced by a quieter, more observational mode. I started noticing external things again. The way sunlight moved across the floor in the afternoon, the smell of coffee in the morning, the cadence of my own breathing. It occurred to me that much of my earlier discomfort came not from the clothing itself but from the stories I told about it. Stories inherited, absorbed, rarely examined. That realization didn't bring relief so much as responsibility. If these stories weren't inherently true, then I had a choice about which ones to keep telling. Choice, I was learning, is heavier than avoidance. It demands follow-through. I marked the nights mentally, notching them like a quiet countdown, but I also began to understand that the real measure wasn't time. It was attention. For the first time in my life, I was paying sustained, honest attention to a part of myself I had kept in the margins. Whether that attention would lead to integration, change, or simply understanding remained unclear. But for the first time, I was no longer pretending the questions didn't exist. And as I turned off the light on the seventh night, settling into a version of myself that still felt provisional but no longer alien, I realized that the lock I'd heard at the beginning hadn't closed something off. It had inconveniently and irrevocably narrowed my focus to the truth I'd been avoiding. By the eighth night, the novelty, if it could ever be called that, had worn off, leaving something heavier and more instructive in its place. What replaced it wasn't comfort exactly, but familiarity, and familiarity has a way of stripping away drama. When you can no longer pretend something is temporary in the immediate sense, you stop reacting and start observing. I began noticing how often my thoughts drifted toward other people even when no one was around. Imagined reactions followed me from room to room like a low-grade echo. What would my father say if he could see me now, not because he was cruel, but because he was precise in his expectations and uncomfortable with ambiguity? What would my coworkers think if they knew this version of me existed outside carefully framed rectangles on a screen? These questions didn't arrive as catastrophes. They arrived as considerations like weather forecasts, uncontrollable but influential. One afternoon I needed groceries. It was the first time I would leave the apartment during the experiment without the plausible deniability of night or anonymity. Standing by the door, keys in hand, I felt a resistance rise in me that had nothing to do with fear of danger and everything to do with fear of definition. Going outside meant crossing an invisible line from private exploration into public reality. I could still choose to end the experiment, to unlock the door in more ways than one. The fact that I hesitated told me how much was at stake. The walk to the store was unremarkable in all the ways that mattered. No one stared. No one commented. The world continued doing what it always does, moving forward without pausing to interpret me. That ordinariness unsettled me more than hostility would have. It suggested that much of what I had been afraid of lived entirely inside my own projections. At the same time, it didn't erase the vulnerability. Being unremarkable did not mean being invisible. It meant being legible in ways I wasn't used to. Inside the store, I caught my reflection in a freezer door and felt a strange detachment. It wasn't disassociation so much as perspective, like seeing a candid photo of yourself and realizing how little control you ever truly have over how you're perceived. I wasn't looking for approval or validation. I was looking for coherence. Did the person in that reflection make sense to me? The answer was complicated and unfinished, but it wasn't no. That trip became a quiet turning point. Not because it was dramatic, but because it reframed the experiment from something I was enduring to something I was participating in. I stopped counting hours and started marking moments, conversations, glances, internal shifts that didn't announce themselves with fanfare. A friend came over later that week, one who knew the outline of what I was doing but not the day-to-day reality. We sat on opposite ends of the couch talking about work, about nothing, about everything adjacent to the obvious. Eventually they looked at me and said gently, "You seem more here. Not happier. Not freer. More present." The observation landed harder than any critique could have. Presence, I realized, had been the missing variable in my life for a long time. That comment forced a kind of moral inventory. If this version of me was more present, more attentive, more careful with words and silences, what did that say about the version I had defaulted to before? I had always believed that integrity was about consistency, about being the same person everywhere. Now I wondered if it was actually about alignment, about reducing the distance between internal truth and external behavior, even when that truth was unfinished. The nights continued, each one less about endurance and more about integration. I began journaling, not to document the experiment but to track my thinking. Patterns emerged. I was less reactive, more reflective. I listened differently, not just to others but to myself. I noticed when I felt defensive and asked why. I noticed when I felt calm and resisted the urge to immediately distrust it. There were still moments of doubt, sharp and insistent. What if this was self-indulgence masquerading as growth? What if I was appropriating an experience that wasn't mine to claim? These questions mattered, and I didn't try to silence them. Instead, I treated them like ethical checkpoints, reminders that exploration doesn't exempt you from responsibility. I read more. I listened to voices that weren't mine. I tried to situate my experience within a larger social context rather than centering it as unique or exceptional. By the end of the second week, I understood something I hadn't anticipated. The experiment wasn't teaching me who I was becoming. It was teaching me how much of who I already was had been shaped by avoidance. The clothing had become almost incidental, a constant rather than a focus. What mattered was the sustained attention, the refusal to look away when things felt uncomfortable or uncertain. On the 14th night, lying awake and listening to the familiar sounds of the building settling around me, I realized that whatever happened when the 30 nights ended, I wouldn't be able to return to ignorance. I had crossed a threshold of awareness, and thresholds once crossed don't disappear just because you stop standing in them. By the time the third week began, the experiment had stopped feeling like an event and started feeling like a condition. Not a burden, not a thrill, but a state of being that colored everything else. This was the part one hadn't planned for, the long middle where there was no adrenaline of beginning and no relief of ending. Just continuity. Just living. Continuity is revealing. It strips away intention and leaves habit exposed. I began to see how much of my earlier life had been built around performance. Not in a deceptive sense but in a maintenance sense. I performed competence, neutrality, steadiness. I had learned early on that being easy made life smoother for everyone else, and I had mistaken that smoothness for virtue. Now, living in a way that required conscious engagement, I noticed how often ease had come at the cost of honesty. The days blurred together in small, instructive ways. I answered emails. I cooked meals. I folded laundry. Each task felt faintly recalibrated, not because the actions themselves were different, but because I was more aware of myself performing them. I noticed how I spoke to customer service representatives, how patient or impatient I was, how much emotional labor I expected from strangers without realizing it. There was a humility creeping in that I hadn't invited but couldn't deny. One afternoon I ran into a neighbor in the hallway, someone I'd passed dozens of times before with nothing more than a nod. This time we stopped. We talked about the weather, about the unreliable elevator, about nothing that mattered. And yet the interaction stayed with me all day. Not because it was affirming or uncomfortable but because it was ordinary. I had braced myself for judgment or curiosity, and instead I got indifference wrapped in politeness. It forced me to confront how much of my fear had been rooted in assuming that I was the center of other people's attention. That realization didn't erase vulnerability, but it contextualized it. Being seen, I was learning, wasn't always the same as being scrutinized. Often it was just being registered and then released. That distinction mattered more than I'd expected. Internally, though, things were less settled. As the novelty faded, deeper questions surfaced. Questions that had nothing to do with clothing and everything to do with identity. If I felt more attentive, more ethically awake during these weeks, was that because I was closer to something true or because discomfort had sharpened my awareness? Was this growth sustainable, or was it contingent on the artificial constraints of the experiment? I wrestled with the idea of permanence. Not in terms of outcomes but in terms of responsibility. If I learned something meaningful about myself during these 30 nights, what obligation did I have to that knowledge afterward? It would be easy to frame the experience as a contained exercise, a personal retreat with no external implications. But that felt dishonest. Insight once gained demands integration. Otherwise, it becomes a kind of hoarded wisdom, inert and self-serving. I thought a lot about empathy during this period, not as an abstract virtue but as a practiced skill. Moving through the world with heightened self-awareness made me more sensitive to the subtle negotiations others were constantly making, how people adjusted themselves in public, how they scanned rooms, how they measured risk and safety in ways I had previously taken for granted. I began to understand that my experiment was voluntary in a way many lived realities are not. That awareness didn't invalidate my experience but it framed it ethically. Curiosity without humility, I realized, is just another form of consumption. Midway through the third week, I had a conversation with my mother. She didn't know about the experiment, not explicitly. We talked about family logistics, about aging relatives, about the familiar constellation of responsibilities that had always defined our relationship. But something in my tone must have shifted because she paused and asked if I was all right. I said yes, and for once it wasn't a reflexive answer. It was considered. I was all right in a way that didn't mean settled or resolved, but attentive and honest. After the call, I sat quietly for a long time thinking about generational narratives, about what gets passed down and what gets left unsaid. I wondered how much of my earlier avoidance had been inherited, modeled, normalized. There was no blame in that thought, just context. Understanding origins doesn't absolve responsibility, but it does soften self-judgment enough to make change possible. The nights, which had once felt like checkpoints, became reflective spaces. I spent more time reading, less time distracting myself. I noticed how often I'd used busyness as a shield, a way to avoid sitting with unresolved feelings. Now sitting was unavoidable. And in that stillness, I encountered grief I hadn't known how to name before. Grief for years spent half-present, grief for conversations not had, grief for versions of myself I had dismissed without examination. But there was also gratitude. Gratitude for the fact that I was asking these questions now rather than never. Gratitude for friends who had offered support without demands. Gratitude for the strange generosity of time-bound commitment, which made honesty feel urgent rather than optional. As the 20th night approached, I became aware of a subtle anxiety about the ending. Not fear of losing the clothing but fear of losing the clarity that had come with the constraint. I worried that without the structure I would slide back into old patterns, that the world would rush in and dull the edges of what I'd learned. That worry told me something important. The experiment had worked not by providing answers but by teaching me how to pay attention. On the 20th night, I stood again in front of the mirror, not searching for difference but acknowledging continuity. I didn't look transformed. I looked like someone who had been thinking carefully for a long time. Someone who had learned that identity is less about declaration and more about sustained, ethical engagement with oneself and others. I turned off the light that night with a sense of quiet resolve. Whatever happened next, I knew I could no longer pretend that self-understanding was a luxury or a side project. It was work, ongoing, imperfect, necessary. And I had committed, at least for now, to doing it honestly. Somewhere after the 20th night, time began behaving differently. The days didn't slow down exactly, but they thickened as if each one carried more weight per hour than before. I woke up already thinking, already noticing, already inside myself in a way that left very little room for autopilot. That constant awareness was both the gift and the cost of the experiment. There were moments when I longed for the old dullness, the comfortable blur of habit, but I also knew that returning to it unchanged would feel like a kind of betrayal. What surprised me most during this stretch was how much the experiment began to affect my memories rather than just my present. Past moments resurfaced with new clarity. Casual jokes I'd laughed along with without thinking, assumptions I'd made about others' lives, times I'd dismissed discomfort as weakness, mine or someone else's. These recollections didn't arrive to shame me. They arrived like case studies asking to be reinterpreted with the tools I was only now acquiring. I began to understand how narrowly I'd defined integrity before. I used to think it meant keeping promises, telling the truth, showing up on time. Those things still mattered, but they felt incomplete. Integrity, I was realizing, also meant being accountable for the parts of yourself that never make it into conversation. The silent judgments, the reflexive distancing, the ways you benefit from systems you've never had to question. Living these weeks with heightened visibility, even if limited, made those systems more legible. One evening, I was invited to a small gathering at a friend's place. I debated going for hours. This wasn't a space where anonymity would cushion me. It was a room full of people who knew me at least as I'd been. Declining would have been easy. Accepting felt like stepping onto a narrow bridge without knowing how stable it was. In the end, I went not because I felt brave but because I felt tired of choosing safety by default. The evening unfolded without incident, which felt like an incident in itself. There were moments of curiosity, moments of careful politeness, moments of genuine warmth. No one demanded explanations. No one offered unsolicited conclusions. I answered questions when they were asked and let silence stand when it wasn't. What stayed with me afterward wasn't relief, but a sober understanding of how much energy it takes to exist honestly in social spaces. The labor wasn't in defending myself. It was in staying present, in resisting the urge to preempt discomfort by shrinking. That night, walking home alone, I thought about how many people carry that labor every day, not as an experiment, not as a choice, but as the baseline condition of their lives. The thought settled into me with a weight that felt appropriate. Empathy, I was learning, isn't about imagining yourself in someone else's place for a moment. It's about recognizing the cumulative cost of what you've never had to imagine before. As the nights continued, I noticed changes in how I related to authority and expectation. I was less eager to meet unspoken norms, more willing to pause before complying. This didn't make me rebellious or confrontational. It made me deliberate. I asked myself questions I'd rarely asked before. Is this necessary? Is this honest? Is this kind? Sometimes the answers aligned neatly. Often they didn't. Learning to sit with that ambiguity felt like a form of adulthood I'd been postponing. There were difficult moments, too. Days when the weight of self-scrutiny tipped into exhaustion. On those days I felt raw, thin-skinned, impatient with myself. I worried that I was becoming insular, overly focused on my internal process at the expense of others. That concern mattered and I treated it seriously. I checked my behavior. I reached out instead of withdrawing. I reminded myself that introspection is only ethical when it eventually turns outward, informing how you move through the world rather than trapping you inside your own head. I started volunteering more deliberately during this period, choosing roles that required listening rather than leading. In those spaces, I practiced being attentive without centering myself, present without performing. It was humbling and grounding in equal measure. The experiment, I realized, had sharpened my awareness, but awareness alone wasn't enough. It had to translate into action, however small. As the 25th night approached, thoughts of the ending grew louder. Not celebratory thoughts, not dread exactly, but questions about continuity. Who would I be when the constraint was lifted? What parts of this attentiveness would I fight to keep, and which would I let go out of convenience or fear? I understood now that the 30 nights were never the point. They were a scaffold, temporary by design. The real work would begin when the scaffold was removed. On that night, I sat quietly, the city humming its usual background chorus, and allowed myself to imagine the future without making promises I couldn't keep. I didn't resolve to be a different person overnight. I resolved to remain in conversation with myself, to keep asking uncomfortable questions, to keep listening when answers didn't come easily, to keep acknowledging the ethical dimensions of my choices. What I felt most strongly in those final days wasn't certainty but commitment. Commitment to honesty over ease. Commitment to empathy over assumption. Commitment to the understanding that identity is not a destination you arrive at and declare complete, but a practice you return to again and again, refining it through attention, responsibility, and care. When I lay down on the 26th night, I realized that whatever the final nights held, I was no longer measuring the experience by how it would end. I was measuring it by how it had changed the way I paid attention, to myself, to others, to the quiet moral texture of everyday life. And that change, unlike the lock that had started it all, felt like something that would not simply click open and disappear. The final stretch began without ceremony, which felt appropriate. There was no internal drum roll, no sense of climax approaching. Instead, there was a quiet, almost stubborn normalcy to everything, as if life itself refused to acknowledge that I was nearing the end of something I had once framed as extraordinary. That refusal turned out to be instructive. It suggested that whatever mattered about these 30 nights would have to survive outside the container I'd built for them. I started waking earlier, not out of discipline but out of restlessness. Mornings became reflective spaces, times when my thoughts were clearer before the day layered expectations on top of them. I would sit by the window with coffee and watch the street come alive, people moving with purpose or distraction or both. I found myself wondering less about how they saw me and more about what they were carrying. That shift, from self-monitoring to outward curiosity, felt like one of the most tangible changes of the entire experiment. With fewer nights left than fingers on one hand, I felt an urge to take inventory, but not in the way I'd expected. I wasn't tallying lessons learned or moments survived. I was noticing absences. The absence of constant self-judgment. The absence of urgency to label myself. The absence of the old internal bargaining, just get through this then you can go back. That voice had gone quiet, replaced by something steadier and less dramatic. Pay attention and respond honestly. One afternoon I visited a bookstore I hadn't been to in years. It was the kind of place that smelled faintly of paper and dust, where time seemed to slow down by mutual agreement. I wandered without a plan, pulling books off shelves based on intuition rather than need. I realized standing there how much of my earlier life had been organized around optimization. Maximizing efficiency, minimizing friction. Now I felt drawn to inefficiency, to lingering, to allowing myself to be changed by what I encountered rather than extracting utility from it. I sat on the floor between two shelves and read the opening pages of a memoir by someone whose life had unfolded very differently from mine. Their experiences were not analogous to my own, and I didn't try to make them so. What struck me instead was the clarity with which they described confusion, the respect they gave their own uncertainty. It occurred to me that I had spent years trying to outrun uncertainty, treating it as a flaw to be corrected rather than a condition to be lived with skillfully. That realization reframed how I thought about the end of the experiment. I no longer wanted resolution. I wanted continuity, the ability to carry uncertainty forward without turning it into paralysis or spectacle. I wanted to be someone who could say, I don't know without apologizing for it, someone who could hold complexity without immediately simplifying it for comfort. As the 28th night arrived, I felt an unexpected tenderness toward my former self. Not pity, not embarrassment, but something like respect. I understood now why avoidance had once felt necessary. It had been a survival strategy learned early and practiced well. Letting it go didn't require condemnation. It required gratitude and then a conscious decision to grow beyond it. That distinction mattered. Shame might have motivated change, but it would have poisoned whatever came next. I thought again about responsibility, not just to myself but to others. I had been given the privilege of exploring questions of identity within relative safety, supported by resources and relationships that buffered risk. Acknowledging that privilege didn't diminish the sincerity of my experience. It contextualized it. It reminded me that self-exploration is not morally neutral by default. It carries obligations. To listen more than speak, to avoid appropriating language or struggles that aren't yours, to translate insight into compassion rather than entitlement. On the penultimate night I barely slept. Not from anxiety but from a sense of alertness that bordered on reverence. I moved through the apartment quietly, aware that these walls had held me through something fragile and formative. I touched objects that had been constant, the desk, the chair, the doorframe, and felt a strange gratitude for their indifference. They hadn't judged me. They hadn't required coherence. They had simply been there, allowing me to do the work I needed to do. I wrote for hours that night, not with the intention of recording the experience, but of clarifying my commitments. I didn't promise myself outcomes. I promised practices. To remain curious rather than defensive. To notice when fear was masquerading as reason. To choose honesty even when it complicated my image of myself. To remember that identity is relational, shaped not just by how I see myself but by how my actions affect others. The final night arrived quietly. No fanfare, no countdown. I stood once more in front of the mirror, not searching for confirmation or closure, but offering acknowledgement. I looked like someone who had been paying attention. Someone who had learned that transformation is rarely visible in the ways we expect, and almost never dramatic in retrospect. It shows up instead as a shift in how you carry yourself through uncertainty, how you respond when there is no script to follow. When the lock finally opened, the sound was almost disappointing, smaller, less momentous than the one that had started it all. But I understood then that the significance had never been in the sound. It had been in the sustained willingness to stay with discomfort long enough for it to teach me something honest. I didn't feel finished. I felt oriented. And as I lay down for the last time within the boundaries of the experiment, aware that morning would bring both freedom and responsibility, I understood that the most meaningful transformations don't announce themselves with certainty. They reveal themselves gradually in the way you listen, the way you hesitate, the way you choose to remain accountable to the truths you've uncovered, even when no one else is watching. The morning after the lock opened did not feel like release. It felt like exposure. Without the structure of the agreement, without the symbolic weight of obligation, I was left with something far more demanding: choice. Choice without novelty, without witnesses, without the protective framing of an experiment. I woke up and understood with a clarity that bordered on discomfort, that nothing external would compel me anymore. Whatever I carried forward would do so because I decided to carry it. That realization followed me through the first hours of the day like a quiet supervisor. I moved slowly, deliberately, noticing how often I reached for old defaults. There was a reflex to categorize the experience as over, to file it away as a meaningful but contained chapter. I recognized that impulse for what it was: an attempt to regain narrative control. Endings are comforting because they imply coherence. But life rarely honors clean conclusions, and I had learned enough over the past month to know that forcing one would be a mistake. Instead, I treated the day as observational. I paid attention to how my body moved without the constraint of the rules. I noticed what felt different and what didn't. Some things surprised me with their continuity: the attentiveness, the quieter internal tone, the reluctance to rush past discomfort. Other things surprised me with how quickly they tried to revert. Awareness, I was learning, is not a permanent state you unlock. It's a practice you recommit to, often without applause. I spent time thinking about language, about how I would speak about the experience if and when I spoke about it at all. There was a temptation to simplify, to extract a lesson clean enough to share without vulnerability. I resisted that. Simplification would have been a kind of erasure, not just of the messiness, but of the ethical complexity that had made the experience matter. I understood now that not every insight is meant to be packaged. Some are meant to remain unfinished, shaping behavior quietly rather than announcing themselves as wisdom. In the days that followed, I tested myself in small ways. I paid attention to conversations, noticing when I felt the urge to dominate or withdraw. I asked questions and let answers stand without steering them toward my comfort. I noticed when I felt misunderstood and resisted the impulse to immediately correct the misunderstanding. These were not heroic acts. They were mundane, easily overlooked adjustments. But they accumulated, and in their accumulation I recognized a different kind of integrity taking shape. I also confronted a lingering fear that I would be expected to declare something definitive about who I was now. Labels hovered at the edges of my thinking, offering clarity in exchange for commitment. I didn't reject them outright, but I stopped treating them as deadlines. I allowed myself to exist in a space of informed uncertainty, trusting that responsibility does not require premature conclusions. What mattered more than naming was how I behaved, how I treated others, how I accounted for my impact, how I remained open to being corrected. There were moments of loneliness in this phase, moments when I wished for a script or a community that would tell me exactly how to proceed. But loneliness, I realized, was not the same as isolation. I was not alone because I was doing something wrong. I was alone because growth often outpaces language and companionship for a while. That loneliness softened when I stopped treating it as a problem to solve and started treating it as a signal to stay attentive. I thought often about empathy, about how easily it can become performative if it isn't grounded in sustained attention. I had learned something real about vulnerability during those 30 nights, but I had also learned how limited my perspective still was. That limitation didn't invalidate the learning. It contextualized it. It reminded me that empathy is not a destination you reach, but a discipline you practice, especially when it costs you convenience or certainty. Family interactions took on new texture. I listened more than I spoke. I noticed patterns I had once accepted as immutable and understood that understanding them did not obligate me to perpetuate them. Change, I was learning, does not require rupture. Sometimes it requires quiet persistence, the willingness to behave differently even when no one names the difference. Work too shifted subtly. I became more deliberate about how I gave feedback, how I received it, how I acknowledged uncertainty instead of masking it with confidence. I discovered that credibility did not erode when I admitted complexity. It often deepened. That realization challenged years of conditioning that had equated authority with certainty. I began to see leadership not as control but as stewardship, of conversations, of outcomes, of people's time and trust. There were days when I failed. Days when I slipped into old habits, spoke too quickly, judged too harshly, avoided unnecessary discomfort. The difference now was not perfection but response. I noticed the failure. I reflected on it. I repaired where possible. I didn't collapse into shame or dismiss it as inevitable. Accountability, I was learning, is less about never erring and more about how you respond when you do. As weeks passed, the memory of the experiment settled into something less vivid but more integrated. It stopped demanding attention and started informing it. I no longer thought in terms of before and after. I thought in terms of alignment, how closely my actions tracked my values on any given day, and what adjustments were necessary when they drifted apart. Looking back, I understand now that the 30 nights were never about becoming someone else. They were about becoming available to myself. Available to questions without immediate answers. Available to discomfort without defensiveness. Available to the idea that identity, like ethics, is something you practice, not something you possess. If there is a single truth I carry forward, it is this: transformation that matters is rarely loud. It does not announce itself with certainty or demand recognition. It shows up instead in the way you pause before reacting, the way you listen when it would be easier to assume, the way you choose honesty even when it complicates your sense of self. I did not emerge with a final answer about who I am. I emerged with something more durable, a commitment to stay in conversation with myself and the world, to treat identity as an ongoing responsibility rather than a problem to solve, and to remember that the most meaningful changes often happen quietly, sustained not by spectacle but by attention, integrity, and care.